Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This video marks the final section of my lecture series into Metropolitan conflict. This is going to be section 1.9, and I'm pleased with the lecture series. It'll probably approximate about 10 hours in its totality, so it's not one of the longer lecture series that I've done. But I mean, for the amount of effort that it took for me to compile it, and the amount of effort it took for me to upload it and shoot the videos and such, I think it'll be maybe not a significant contribution, but it's a good enough contribution, right? So I hope more than anything that you were able to take something out of what I said in the last 10 hours and use it in your research study and your dissertation, what have you. So this marks the end of the lecture series. This is section 1.9. This is page 22 of my notes. As you know, you can click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Download the PDF. Use it to supplement your reading. And let's begin the final section on the bottom of page 22. So this is Metropolitan conflict. And this is section 1.9. And this is going to be disproportional influences on urban criminality. And this is going to be very important, right? It's going to be very important. What's important about this, however, as you see at the bottom of the notes, report says poor are moving to the nation's suburbs. So this is Associated Press, and the idea is if we talk about criminality and poverty as being associated, so that an increase in poverty is correlated with the likely increase in criminality and incarceration. And we also argue that, as I will in this section, that there is now a migration of poverty from the central city into the suburbs, where there is a preponderance of poverty now localized. Then it leads us to believe or to anticipate a potential rise in criminality in the suburbs, which is something that we've never really conceptualized, right? We think of, in terms of we being Americans, Americans think of criminality as being localized within the ghetto, as being localized within urban areas in the city center. Americans don't think of criminality, though Americans know that there's crime and domestic violence and such in the burbs. The burbs is not the place where criminality thrives. I don't see that it's going to become the place that criminality thrives either, but it's important to recognize that we need to anticipate a potential elevation of criminality in the suburbs as merely a preventative means, right? So the discussion is going to be couched within that correlation, and with that, let's begin. So the migration of poverty to the suburbs. Number one, the first concentration of minorities into minority neighborhoods prior to 1968 may in fact be offset by the recent developments in the U.S. housing market. New findings indicate, quote, more people live in the nation's suburbs than in urban cities because of the affordable housing, service sector jobs, and increased use of housing vouchers. And the citation is from, on the next page, it's the same thing. The report says, so you can just Google it if you want to see the report yourself. The title of the article is Report Says Poor Are Moving to Nation's Suburbs. So the idea is more people are moving from the city central into the suburbs. Why? Because there is affordable housing, there are service sector jobs. This is what I was talking about before, service sector being sort of strip mall jobs, the mall itself, retail jobs within and of course retail employment is the largest employment in the United States of America. So in terms of retail employment, the proximity to the suburban community coupled with affordable housing is one reason why there has been this migration. Not of just poor people, but there's been a transformation, right? An overrepresentation now of poorer communities in the suburbs. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a bit. So page 23, number 2, so this is a hypothetical, right? If the correlation between poverty and criminality is strong, then one can reasonably predict a rise in crime in the suburbs, right? The idea is, if we say that as poverty increases, so it would look like this, right? If we have poverty and criminality, then it looks something like that, right? As poverty increases, criminality increases, right? If that is true, and it's not a demonstration of proof, it's just if that correlation is strong, if there's a strong correlation between a rise in poverty and an increase in criminality, and we say that poverty has spread and is now concentrated in the suburbs, it would lead us to predict that criminality might start to proliferate within the suburbs. Not as a fact, as a possibility, as a tendency. If there is no rise in crime within the suburbs, and the nation's poor now live with more prevalence in the suburbs than the urban cities, then the correlation should be reconsidered. So here's the idea. In terms of this correlation applies specifically now, in a contemporary example, to the concentration of poverty in the city central. So it applies to the city. But since we recognize that poverty has moved to the suburbs, right? Since we recognize now via this article that poverty has moved to the suburbs, then we would imagine that the criminality represented in the city should be manifest, right? It should be identifiable, empirically verifiable in the suburbs. If this correlation does not hold in the suburbs, but it does hold in the city, then we have a justifiable means for sort of statistical justification, right? It's going to be a bit suspicious, right? Is it race-based discrimination? Is it any number of factors? Is it discrimination against minorities and ethnic groups, what have you? But the idea is, if the correlation holds in the city, then it should hold in the suburbs. If it does not hold in the suburbs, but still holds in the city, then we have to reconceptualize the nature of the correlation. Maybe there really isn't a correlation between criminality and poverty, because it would seem to have to hold that there should be an increase in the suburbs. Now, in terms of urban conflict, and obviously the section title being urban criminality, part of the understanding in terms of any criminal justice system is one of, and this is nothing new, criminality sort of 101, understanding the concept of criminality, requires that there is a presence of a police presence, that there is surveillance in place. That surveillance is part of the infrastructure of the city. Now the question is, well, Jason, it's actually a little bit more complicated. You can't immediately say that this correlation is something that exists de facto. This correlation is also a consequence of the infrastructural investment in surveillance and also the appropriation of police presence in the city, which bolsters the correlation between poverty and criminality. And without the infrastructural investment in surveillance technology in the burbs, and without the equal appropriation of police representation in the suburbs, you can never have the amount of incarceration in the suburbs as you have in the city. If that's the case, then the argument becomes, shouldn't it be, to be fair, shouldn't it be the case that surveillance technology is either lessened in the city or increased in the burbs, or shouldn't it be the case that police presence is either lessened in the city or increased in the burbs? So that's the idea. It's not for me to say. There are way too many variables in that for me to spend any amount of time with it. I'm not a criminal justice teacher. I don't teach criminology. But for those of you who are interested in the judicial system, who are interested in criminology, think about that concept, right? Think about the correlation between poverty and criminality. Think about the nature of criminality, both in terms of deviance, but also in terms of social deviance, but also in terms of police presence and surveillance and all of the rest, and think about how we can make sense of any divergence empirically between existing incarceration rates as it pertains to urban communities and predicted incarceration rates or predicted criminality, criminal offenses within this growing poverty within the suburbs, right? If the suburbs are poor and equally poor as the city, with an overrepresentation of incarceration in the city, then somebody needs to explain something, right? Then the burden of proof is in someone else's court to explain why that is the case. What I want to do now is to articulate the potential conflict, and you can guarantee that this is a potential conflict to varying degrees, just to be on record as saying it, because, you know, that's kind of the stuff that I do. So, all right, 2A, top of the page 23. Assessing this correlation would make a good contribution to social science research, duh. Okay, and obviously it would. I think it's important that social theorists think about the potential conflict that might arise. And obviously this pertains to favoritism, bias. This might pertain to ethnical, racial discrimination. This might pertain to an over-representation of police presence in the city. It might pertain to surveillance and privacy, and on and on and on. There's any number of variables that will inform this correlation, but the idea is to make a prediction that tensions will arise. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be increased incarceration for residents of suburban communities. It doesn't necessarily imply that, but the idea is there's a potential social and possible racial, ethnic conflict as a consequence of the fact that poverty has already expanded into suburban communities, right? So with that expanded poverty, the expectation is the increased likelihood for criminality and criminal behavior. And the question is, what might that look like? It probably won't look like the same criminal behavior in the cities. What might it look like in the next decade or two? Okay, so 3 disproportional influences on urban communities. Number 1, urban zoning laws. And I've spoken about zoning laws and the way that they were used as a consequence of alleviating affluent communities, white communities, of the quote-unquote nuisance of minority communities and the integration of lower socioeconomic strata into the proximity of their residents. So, quote, most African Americans were confined, important, right, confined to the decaying, here's that word again, right, confined to the decaying cores of large cities during the that's supposed to say post World War II era by governmental and private housing policies, and as a result, they were denied access to jobs, schools, and housing enjoyed by white Americans who moved to the suburbs, right? So, there's no surprise, an abuse of zoning laws resulted in the attempt to enforce concentration, right, via forced concentration of African American and minority communities, which were associated with impoverished communities at the expense of any integration in suburban areas. A, since zoning laws obviously regulate the physical location of businesses and homes, and the proximity of each to each is obvious in the proximity of each to each, the obvious correlation demands that where zoning laws decrease the proximity between houses and business, where both are densely populated, there's a clear potential conflict for the business community if the surrounding housing population is low income. What in the world does that mean? So here's the example. If you have, in sort of city development, right? So let's read what I wrote, right? Where zoning laws decrease the proximity between housing and businesses, where both are densely populated, right? So you have business, high density, business or commerce, right? So you have high density business here, and you have a large proximity to housing communities. So this is business, large prox, and then you have housing. That large proximity is going to insulate the business community, right? Theoretically, at least. I mean, you'd have to look at the stats on this, but theoretically, there has to be some empirical, I mean, someone has probably, I hope someone's done this study, like and I would imagine, and especially in zoning, somebody has to have already done this study. I don't know the literature well enough to know who this is, but I would imagine someone has, and if someone hasn't, then someone should do this study. But there's probably an empirically verifiable distance at which it's the best location to have your business established. You want your business close enough, especially if it's service orientation, you want your business close enough so that the commute to the business by potential customers in the burbs isn't too far, but you don't want it so close, right? You don't want it so close. You don't want it so close, coupled with very low income housing, right? If this type of housing is identified as low income, then without sounding racist, right? Without sounding racist, and it's actually not, it's not even race, it's not race-based per se. You think black, but it doesn't have to be race. It's weird that even as an American, like you think that way, right? Oh, it's black people. It doesn't have to be. It's just impoverished people, it's poor people. In close proximity to business, you increase the likelihood for criminality, right? I can just walk down the street and rob this, I can rob the store. I can rob the guy, you know, at the bodega at the corner. I can rob this, you know, you can go and, you know, do any number of things. And that proximity, that decrease in proximity between housing and business sectors of the community with a high concentration of poverty, it's a hotbed for conflict. The question is that inherent within the design of the city itself? Is that an inherency within the infrastructure itself? It's a very, 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 very good question. Why? Because if you just think statistically, we don't even have to talk about human inclination. You don't have to talk about black or white relations or Hispanic and black relations. You don't have to talk about any of that. If you have a concentration of poor people in a high density housing unit or area within close walking proximity to businesses that have money, that have services they provide for money, and that have goods that they sell for money, you increase the statistical likelihood that the lack of money will gravitate to the source of money as a means of sustaining their livelihood. So that, to be clear, because this is quite on another level, this is no Mickey Mouse at all, shout out to Mickey, but to be clear, it isn't a defense of the fact. I don't want it to be the fact that, oh, well, Jason, so you're just defending the fact that there won't be increased criminality in the suburbs because of this proximity argument, but in a sense, that's exactly what I'm doing, right? We have to take into account that the actual physical infrastructural design of the city, the city and the suburbs. For the suburbs, criminality might be disincentivized because of sprawl. Right? I have to, I'm not going to drive all the way from the house to the nearest Walmart, or drive all the way from the house to the nearest, the nearest corner store to rob because it's too far. Right? The business community is insulated by distance. There's a certain sense of security and insulation that, and this is a fact, there's a certain sense of security and insulation afforded by inaccessibility. It's not accessible. The accessibility in terms of a decreased proximity between high density, low income and the availability, and this is an infrastructural design. This is the design. And the proximity to businesses, outlets, and venues increases the statistical likelihood that someone in a destitute state will seek to alleviate their destitution by robbing, stealing, and such and such and such and such. Why is that important? Because a recognition of this, it would be an amazing empirical analysis, the recognition of, and shout out to people who do this. I'm trying to do my work conceptually to give it to people so they can actually do this. But in terms of next generation city planning, what I would want to do before I plan this next generation city is to look at crime rates within the inner city. Look at crime rates in the inner city, and for those convicted criminals who we know committed crime X in terms of like crimes against businesses, you know, robbery, theft, blah, blah, blah. The proximity, the location of the crime, and the residence of the criminal. And take a statistical, you should have an enormous N for something like this, you know, 15,000, 20,000. Go through the sort of robbery records and look at the proximal location of the residence of the criminal and the site of the crime. And then do an empirical analysis of that distance. So first it would be the identification of the crime, it would be the identification of the criminal's residence, and then it would be an identification of the site of the crime. The next thing that you would need to do is to take the distance of the between the distance of the residence and the site of the crime. And then you aggregate all of that data. Right? Aggregate all that data and figure out what the average, for people who do this type of crime, the average distance, this is genius actually, right? The average distance that the resident, that the particular criminal lives from the location of the crime. And make sure that that distance is larger than the distance in the next cities that we build. So let's say it's an average of 10 miles or 6 miles. Make sure that in zoning the next generation cities, that the distance between your business, community, service orientation, blah, 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 and the fringes of whatever housing is greater than that, because you might disincentivize, you might decrease the rate of, I mean, it's a stretch, but numbers do magical things. Numbers do magical things. So it's one idea of how we can approach next generation city design empirically, not fancifully, but empirically, with the realization that there is a statistical fact that associates our social functions, our social functions, not the word, our social practices or social behavior. I wouldn't say there's a social function for criminality, but our social behavior, the social fact that we commit crimes, and develop our cities to mitigate that statistical fact, right? To try and suppress that statistical fact in terms of criminality and such. Okay, so we did that. So this would be 3AI. See the reference for Ice Cube's song Black Korea. So watch this song about Black Korea, and what ends up happening, what we have is low-income housing, which is populated by blacks, and then you have Korean business owners who do their business in close proximity to black residents. Korean business owners live outside, they live in the suburbs, and what ends up happening, and this is sort of the precondition for the LA riots of the 90s, what ends up happening is a growing sense of dissatisfaction. That dissatisfaction turns to animosity for the economic opportunities afforded to quote-unquote middlemen. And I do this in my race theory course, so I'm not going to go into this now. If you're interested, just look for my race theory lectures, access the PDF by clicking any one of the videos, and it is Control-Find Middleman in my notes, and you can watch the corresponding videos and read the notes, sort of middleman theory. And the idea is Asian community, this is a bit pejorative here, it's a bit of a generalization, obviously, but it's not my theoretical account, this is existing literature, argues that the middleman theory is you have non-white minorities represented in predominantly black communities as the conduits with which the economic engine afforded by consumption of the black community is extracted from the black community to other affluent white and other communities, such that it's unidirectional, right? There isn't a consumption of black dollars and an investment in black products, quote-unquote black products, and we'll see this later when we go to the actual riot. But there is a hotbed of tension as a consequence of economic displacement and the representation of other competing minority groups within the close proximity of impoverished black communities that served as the hotbed for what ended up being a pretty violent riot. Alright, so two then, at the bottom, you can read the article to get greater insight into the nature of the grievance, which generally pertain to one, perceived or real injustices, and two, horizontal violence. Horizontal violence is interracial violence. Violence between different ethnical groups, right? Between different racial groups. So what ends up happening as a consequence of this proximity is that we realize now that proximity has it's substantiated empirically. So we're not talking about something conceptual, we're talking about something real. We're talking about something measurable. The example hypothetical, albeit a hypothetical example that I gave in terms of how we could create a social science research project to assess criminality with respect to proximity is important. Why? Because the findings, provided we have a substantial enough N, the findings of such a research, which may or may not exist, I don't know because I didn't do any background, I didn't seek, I didn't search to find out if this research was already in place. The statistical findings of such would incentivize developers to make sure that they have that, an additional mile buffer in the building of the next metropolitan communities. Why? Because we have statistical findings saying that criminality and robbery and such is at its height within this particular distance. So why don't we just build in a larger distance and thus likely decrease? And then of course we wait 20 years, we do the findings, see if that actually worked. If it did, great, right? But this is sort of how numbers work. We don't think they talk to us, but they do. I think it's important that we realize that part of the problem of criminality, this is key, people, part of the problem of criminality isn't about race. It isn't even so much about poverty. Of course, I recognize it is about poverty. It's about the combination of poverty with proximity. This proximity represents an opportunity, and there is always going to be a statistical fact that certain members of the community, given that impoverishment, coupled with the proximity to the quote-unquote opportunity of getting quick money, robbing people, stealing, theft, what have you, larceny, you name it, there's a statistical fact, a certain segment, relatively small segment of the total community will opt into that opportunity and thus enter the penitentiary system. If we want to decrease the likelihood of criminal behavior in future developments, not in existing developments, we need to run some numbers and make sure that we build with those numbers in mind. So it's definitely pushing it. My idea is pushing it out there quite a bit. But, if I was a developer and I was investing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in an investment, it would behoove me to, pay some researcher a couple grand to run some numbers and tell me the best way to build my city. I think it's practically and feasibly important to recognize the fact, right? So, and again, I'm not trying to say that, again, to be clear, I'm not trying to say that the way in which we infrastructurally build will stop crime. That's ridiculous. But it could be the case that the way in which we build the actual infrastructure itself, prior to population of people, could decrease crime. That's what I'm saying, right? I'm not saying that it would alleviate crime. It would eliminate crime. What I am saying, though, is infrastructural development, at least theoretically, just the building itself, and the proximity and the distance between buildings itself, and the way in which communities are organized prior to population itself, could, at least theoretically, given everything that I've said, decrease crime, which is important. And thus, decreased crime attracts middle-class families, and that generates tax revenue, and blah, 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 blah. All right. So, B, at the very bottom of page 23, 3 misuses of zoning laws. So let's look at this. Top of page 24. Containment. Blacks should be quarantined in ice. This is a quote, right? Blacks, and of course I forgot the citation, Jason, sorry about that, people. I forgot the 16. Okay, so this comes from, no, I didn't forget the, well, I forgot the page number, but this comes from page 23, Christopher Silver's work. So these are 3 misuses of zoning laws. One is to contain. You use zoning laws as a means of containing those who have been excluded, those who have been selected against. So blacks should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbances, to prevent the spread of communicable disease, and to protect property value. Oh my goodness, I mean, that is about as racist as they come. I mean, think about it, right? Communicable diseases, right? Okay, sure. So you get the idea. Zoning laws as a means of containment. Zoning laws also as a means of control. Use zoning laws as an, quote, effective social control mechanism for blacks and other undesirables, right? It's a way in which we control. What do we control? As I said in the last section, section 1.8, or maybe it was even 1.7, we use zoning laws as a means of preserving the exclusivity of those we have allegiance with, and simultaneously excluding those with which we have indifference for which we are apathetic. So containment, control, and lastly segregation. This is quote-unquote Reconstruction. So Robert Whitten's Atlanta zoning plan of 1922 was a prominent post-Buchanan attempt to link legalized residential segregation and comprehensive planning. And the idea in a foregone era was to associate city planning, much like I'm doing now, and to determine the nature of our communities, much like I'm doing now. However, one of the key variables associated in planning, integral to the planning process, was one of race. And thus, it was an attempt to compartmentalize racially. The problem is, it failed. The problem is, our communities, affluent white communities, middle-class communities, because of any number of things, outsourcing of labor, neoliberal economics, virtual communities, you have it, you name it, blah, 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 the rise of every other country in the world, and their contribution to any number of industries has resulted in a depressed economic environment nationally, coupled with the economic crash of '08. As a consequence, it's no longer about race. There's a ton of poor white people. It's not about race. Has nothing to do with poverty now, and anybody who even evokes that argument is lying to themselves, and they know they're lying to themselves. Poverty it's a good and a bad thing in a sense. It's a bad thing because it's expanded, but I don't want to say it's good, but it's finally the recognition that there is no inherency between the association of race and poverty. There are tons and tons and tons and tons of poor, well-mannered, great, morally good white people, right? So this idea of communicable diseases for blacks and the immorality of the black community and da-da-da, we ought not to transpose that, right? Even despite the fact that we were labeled and stigmatized in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and such. Because of our poverty as such, we ought not to do that to our white brothers and sisters, right? We ought not to say, well, now you're poor now, so guess what? I guess you're the morally repugnant one, and you're the... We ought not to do that. What we need to recognize is poverty knows no race, obviously. Now we know this for a fact. And as a consequence, try and create conditions in which we can address some of the problems of poverty. And one of the main problems of poverty is that it creates a state of destitution. That state of your desperate times calls for desperate measures, sort of this mentality, this adage is not going to be of statistical significance for the vast majority of poor people. But a good percentage will, in desperate times, act desperately, and that desperation, that sense of desperation, will often manifest in criminality. Thus, if we can alleviate some of the desperation, we might be able to alleviate some of the criminality, but that too needs to be statistically verified and such. So I would imagine, I don't know this for a fact, so don't take my word on this, right? I guess I am quite a bit of an authority, but I don't want to see myself as an authority, so don't take my word on this because I don't see myself as an authority. But I would imagine that criminal justice would, I would imagine, you know, in the next 5-10 years, there's going to be room for huge growth in criminal justice, not with respect to its practical ability per se, in terms of security service personnel and such, surveillance technology and design, not that, but criminal justice in terms of new theoretical structures, concepts needed to be developed, books need to be published. There will absolutely have to be new theoretical paradigms to account for the migration of poverty into the suburbs, and how we, as, I'm not part of this, I always channel whoever I'm talking about, but how we as criminal justice theorists, PhDs in criminology, conceptualize next generation crime prevention as it pertains to any number of things, as it pertains to white ethnical race. Now that white ethnicity is fully entrenched in poverty along with the rest of America, how we make sense of suburbanite relations and criminality within the suburbs as opposed to criminality within the urban communities and such. So there's undeniably going to be a need for tons and tons and tons and tons of theoretical discussion for how we might conceptualize any number of factors. I'm not entrenched in the discipline. I know theory well. This is actually meta, but just for those of you who are criminologists, there's room for your expertise. Okay, so see, the initial purpose of zoning ordinances were to protect the quote-unquote expanding residential areas from industrial nuisances. Now the nuisances are with respect to the pollution associated with living in and around an industrial area, the noise associated with living in and around an industrial area, the danger of living in and around an industrial area and such, right? And all of the consequences of NIMBY. Soon, however, city planners recognized that zoning laws could be used for social reform as well as land use. So there's a recognition immediately that it's not just about the appropriation of land. We're not talking about the use of zoning laws to demarcate our land. We can use zoning laws to change our social relations. And that realization transposed the idea of nuisance from its association with the functioning of industry to nuisance as applied to the moral character, the demeanor, the trustworthiness of minority groups. And attempts were made to seek, quote, legally defensible ways to use zoning to control black residential change. And I talked about that. So number 2, institutional injustices and economic grievances. A community without money, generally surrounded by businesses with money, is a potential breeding ground for crime. This is what I'm talking about here, including especially robbery, assault, extortion, and such. So that what we see, unfortunately, is another, not necessarily prediction. I hope all of these we're wrong, but we have to, our police force, those who protect and serve us should be aware of this, because this is a well-established phenomenon in the third world. It's a well-established phenomenon outside of the U.S. It's not so established in the U.S. And also, if you're a creative writer, this might make for good creative writing as well. But the idea of extortion is key, because in terms of extortion, it incentivizes, not even incentivizes, extortion is necessitated by some level of organization. If you're going to go into extortion, you can't really do effective extortion without organization. If you are in the organization of extorting, then you increase obviously organized crime, organized criminality. Organized crime has always been associated with urban development. It's been associated with this inner city. It's been associated with with unionization and such, organized crime has been entrenched in sort of that sort of cliched organized crime. But the question then becomes, what will this next generation of organized crime look like with respect to its presence both in the city and maybe its presence in the suburbs? How might that look? My initial inclination is to say this is more ATF DEA stuff, right? I'm not going to get into that specifically, but I mean, organized crime, maybe not so much in terms of extortion because you would need proximity to business communities, but you can imagine organized crime, and this probably is already the case. I don't think that this is anything new. I think this is pretty obvious. In terms of meth labs, drug labs, you do business in the suburbs. So that you can imagine the complications that confound law service personnel, that confound their ability to protect and to serve, if we are now talking about millions, hundreds of millions, I doubt it's billions, it's probably not billions, but maybe, who knows, I don't know, maybe billions of dollars of revenue in terms of drugs generated in the suburbs. Oh my goodness, what does that mean for privacy? What does that mean for protection? What does that mean? Now you can imagine the type of suburban community it is, though, right? It's probably on the lower end of the spectrum, and thus, does the word suburbs even make sense anymore? If poverty is growing, obviously the type of places that might have been suburban before might be some new place, and are we on the brink of an emerging new type of residential dwelling, right? I don't know. But we should be thinking about this. Part of why I do what I do so much, teaching, is that you learn a lot by preparing and presenting. You, as students, I'm talking more to students because I know other faculty watch me, so if you're faculty, I'm not talking to you, obviously. But for students who I'm making this for, students, you need to get in the process of taking the stuff that you read, translating the stuff that you read into your own sort of words and your own verbiage, and going to conferences presenting this stuff. This, for me, is almost like conference presentation, because despite the fact that I'm not getting questions and answers from the community, I always have an objector or some interlocutor posited in my head, and I'm in this discussion that allows me to offer new concepts that people just wouldn't get from the direct reading itself. Get in the habit of pushing your reading beyond the literature, beyond the text itself, to something practical, and an attempt to identify the projected likelihood that these social relations will manifest in greater conflict. And think about the representation of governmental forces and local authorities to help mitigate that. If you can start to think like that, you can start to see a much more macro level relation between us and those who are in place to protect us, between us and those who are seeking to satisfy our desire for intoxication via drugs and such. And you can realize how complicated this next generation of residential dwelling in general will be. And I think criminologists and criminal theorists, there's going to be huge. I know this for a fact. There's going to be a huge need for new literature, and there probably already is. So forgive me if there's already a ton of literature on this. I'm not in the criminology field, but for me, I'm just a little bit of presentation. You recognize, no, there's going to have to be a whole lot done to reconceptualize some of the assumptions that we have, because our residential communities are changing. We might need a new concept for certain types of residential dwelling. The expansion of poverty into the suburbs. The expansion of poverty in the suburbs is going to transform, to a great degree, how we make sense of our suburban communities, our inner cities, and such. And we're going to need theorists to help in this conceptualization. So I think that's going to be key. All right. So the next. This is C. Wait, where did I go? Oh, no, this is social reform land use. Okay. This is the middleman minority theory. It's funny, I talked about this, but my middleman minority theory is actually right here. I thought it was in my race lecture. So middleman minority theory, The within communal conflict is exacerbated by other minority groups, that is, non-dominant minority groups. So you have blacks as dominant minority group, you have Koreans as non-dominant minority groups, proximally doing business with, in the same proximity, doing business with primarily black consumers, and the money generated from this urban community doesn't stay within the community, it's exported out. And this is the fundamental basis for the conflict. So that explains that. So that assumed control of the surrounding business. Thus, in a black urban low-income community surrounded by Korean business owners, as an example, the inevitable black on Korean crime rate is sure to manifest, right? So you can even make predictions just based on proximity alone, as I said. That prediction is going to invariably have a racial component to it. So it's important to recognize that in terms of city planning, city management, that race is eventually going to be a factor. You can't talk about criminality now, yet, without the inherency of people's assumptions of race. So that when you talk about crimes of a specific type, you think a race, you can think black, you can think white, you can think other, and that is a consequence of our social arrangements. If our social arrangements change, those assumptions about race and criminality would change. So it's not about changing the associations that people have. We don't have that much power. What it is about is the gradual transformation of social relationships, and those social relationships will change our perception of race and criminality. So that's critically important, but it's easier said than done. It wasn't easy to say, but it's definitely easier said than done. Bottom of the page, this is A. So, quote, some researchers point to non-black merchants' positions as middleman minorities who provoke resentment because they serve poor black customers. And that's obvious, right? It's like I wouldn't want to be here. So you can see this sort of the antagonism. There's no respect for the community. There's no respect for the businesses. There's conflict. And I'm generalizing, obviously, because it's not to say there's some inherent disdain between blacks and Koreans. I'm using the example because it served as the consequence for the LA riots, which I'm about to discuss on page 25. So top of page 25. 1 second. Top of page 25. So for example, tensions have emerged between African American residents and Korean business owners, this is a direct quote, in ghetto areas, as demonstrated by the attacks of the businesses during the LA riots. So Korean business owners as the go-betweeners, right, as the middlemen, affording economic accessibility to ghetto dollars. So see my lecture on ethnic conflict for a more detailed explanation. Just click the link; it'll take you to the PDF. Now, in terms of the combination then of middlemen and the mass exportation of black dollars, quote unquote, out of the ghetto, so that it's not circulating back into the black community, coupled with police brutality and overrepresentation of surveillance or not, blah blah blah, you can recognize that it's almost like a cauldron, right? It's a hotbed of potential conflict. So what ends up happening is police profiling and brutality basically becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. This doesn't always have to be the case. There's any number of factors, but the truth of the matter is there is a recognition that, in part, now I'm talking specifically about the LA riots, it isn't so much that the consequence of the Rodney King verdict was inherently about police brutality. I think it's a misnomer to make that generalization. That, of course, it was brutal. You know, you watch the video, you see Rodney King being beaten, however you interpret it, and you think to yourself, this is unfair, and I want to fight back. This is not right. Yeah, that there is some legitimacy to the fact that it was sort of a direct consequence of viewing the video and recognizing that the police officers were freed and free to go. But that's too easy. Really, the judicial, the failure for many who believe that it was a failure of the judicial system wasn't really the impetus for the conflict. There was already an existing conflict. There was already decades worth of existing hostility that had already been brewing. Were there not to have been that existing conflict, were there not to have been that existing sense of favoritism and a disservice to, in this case, the black community, then it isn't guaranteed. It's not guaranteed that the findings of the court in terms of the innocence of the police officers would have led to the riots. So that it was more than just the beating, right? It was the beating of Rodney King. It was the findings of the court coupled with the existing economic deprivation of the black community that in its totality resulted in this manifestation of frustration through rioting. It's important to recognize that it wasn't, this sort of myopic approach that says, oh, it was this fact and only this fact that led to it is ridiculous, because participation in that riot for any number of people, for everybody who did participate, was a consequence of many factors, and all of those social factors in unison accounted for the sort of orgy of criminality that is a riot. So after the Rodney King police beating, video aired, and here's the video, and the subsequent, well, actually I think it's a picture, and the subsequent riot that unfolded as a consequence of his beating, these signs became prevalent as a means of safeguarding black-owned businesses. And it was black-owned things, right? Why is that important? Why did that find its way, this fact find its way into the lecture? It found its way into the lecture because there's at least two, I can probably think of maybe more than two, but there's at least two initial key points associated with the presentation of the image black-owned. First, the obvious. Black-owned is an indication to potential looters that, hey, I'm just like you. We have affinity, and since we have affinity, don't destroy my property, because I'm just like you. Okay, so that's obvious. The less obvious is what the statement does, the statement of black-owned. It tells the community that in terms of the conflict, in terms of the existing stressors, I have suffered along with you. Don't harm my business, don't harm my property, because I've suffered with you already. So you would be doing me a disservice, because I, at the end of the day, when I hang up my hat, close my door, flip the sign to close and walk outside, I'm suffering just like you're suffering. Right? So that there is, in terms of being black-owned, there is a recognition that the state of suffrage is shared among members of the same ethnical community who has been marginalized and oppressed historically. The intent to destroy the property of someone who has experienced the same level of marginalization and oppression as another is to compound one's marginalization, is to compound one's subjugation. And thus, it is a reminder at a much deeper level. There's more, but I'd stop here. But at a little bit deeper, I wouldn't say much deeper level, but at a second level, it is a reminder of not just allegiance, but a reminder in one's marginalization. I am marginalized and suffer like you, and it would be wrong for you to compound that by destroying my property. In terms of race and metropolitan development, I really could just do, and maybe I'll encourage others to do if you're so inclined, to do, a lecture or discussion or hold a conference or do something about not just metropolitan conflict, but the relationship between, I wouldn't say the inherency, but the relationship between race and metropolitan conflict, so that you could amend this lecture and do a lecture specifically just on, or write an article just on, or host a conference just on race relations in metropolitan areas, or race relations and race conflict within the metropolitan community. Why? Because the ability to demonstrate favoritism, economic opportunity, educational opportunity afforded to certain ethnical groups and not others is going to incentivize race-based conflict. As I did in another lecture series, another economic indicator as a historical fact that has been used to exacerbate the antagonism between ethnical groups, racial groups, has been that of strike breakers. And I've talked about this in a different lecture series. There is, as a recognition of the unwillingness to work for low wages, the right to strike. Workers strike. As a consequence of that action, employers, managers recognize they need to have laborers in place, and they pick from a pool of laborers that are willing to work for lower wages. This labor pool historically has been minority. It can be any number of minority based, but it's been minority identified, right? It's been identified by a particular ethnical racial group. Thus, their employment now, as a means of breaking the strike, constitutes and reinforces the resentment for that racial group generally. So it's important to recognize that in terms of metropolitan conflict, part and parcel with metropolitan conflict is going to be the diversification of racial groups within the metropolitan and ethnical groups within the metropolitan community, and employers can, unfortunately, antagonize racial violence and racial hatred and just conflict, metropolitan conflict in general, by pitting racial groups against others as a means of economic desperation. Thus, it's important, absolutely important, that we put poverty at the top of the list. Because with poverty, I mean, criminality, violence, you name it, everything. I mean, just the decay and the destitution of any number of psychological states of well-being, or institutional, operationally functional states of repair or disrepair are themselves jeopardized by poverty. So it's it's very, very important because it has systemic implications. Bottom of the page, page 25, the combination of two competing minority groups, one defined by the saturation of low-income housing, the other by business products and services provided to the community via middleman minority theory, served as a continual source of community grievances, which is more indicative of the explosion into the riot, right? In combination with the findings of the jury and the ultimate judgment in terms of the Rodney King case, coupled with this middleman theory of favoritism, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. See, there is a possibility that despite the migration of the nation's poor into the suburbs, crime rates do not dramatically elevate within the suburbs because of the proximal insulation of suburban housing. I talked about this. It's amazing that I didn't remember because I haven't looked at these notes since I wrote it. By means of zoning laws, insulates the suburban communities from the temptations that are more prevalent in urban communities via proximal access to local businesses. So, potential research topics, future research, relations between differences in zoning laws and comparative crime rates. I gave you some ideas with respect to that. And then lastly, relationship between dominant minority groups in urban spaces and minority groups facilitating business needs as a consequence of assessing middleman minority theory and the exportation of black dollars or minority dollars. It could be Hispanic, it could be Asian, it could be anybody. That concludes this section of my lecture series, section 1.9, and it also concludes the lecture series in its entirety. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my video on metropolitan conflict. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.